An acknowledgement. The town of Aurora acknowledges that the Anishinaabe lands in which we live and work are on the traditional lands and treaty territories of the Chippewas of Georgina Island, as well as many other nations whose presence here today continues. As the closest First Nation community to Aurora, we recognize the special relationship the Chippewas have with the lands and waters of this territory. They are the water protectors and environmental stewards of these lands, and as a municipality, we join them in these responsibilities. We further acknowledge that Aurora is part of the treaty lands of the Mississaugas and Chippewas recognized through Treaty Number 13, as well as the Williams Treaties of 1923. A shared understanding of how the rich cultural heritage that has existed for centuries and how our collective past has brought us to where we are today will help us walk together into a better future. It's always so lovely saying. Okay. Approval of the agenda of the last minutes. May I have a mover and a seconder to approve the agenda for the meeting of, what was the date, Madam Clerk? Sorry. The agenda? When we're approving the minutes, I just don't have it in front of me. Is it February? Oh, February 26th, 2024. Oh, wait. Oh. Pardon me. Oh, yeah. I'm just gonna have approval for the agenda. Can we have a motion to approve it? Alain, second by Nicole. Any questions or comments about the agenda? Excellent. All those in favor? Opposed? That carries. Apologies, my mind was somewhere else. Any declarations of pecuniary interest? No? Seeing none? Okay, now to the minutes. I'm getting ahead of myself. Number 5, receipt of the minutes of 5.1, the Environmental Advisory Committee meeting minutes of February 26th. If there's no other comments or questions about these minutes, may I have a mover and a seconder to receive these minutes? Oh. Ken, comments?
No, just wanted to move.
Oh, I'm so sorry. All right. Thank you very much. All right. So Ken and Dennis Hang want to move the minutes. I saw your hand up. I'll call the vote. All those in favor of receiving the minutes? Opposed? That carries. Okay, delegations. We don't have any delegations this evening. We'll move to matters of consideration. Memorandum for the Energy and Climate Change Analysis regarding the 2024 Energy Conservation and Demand Management Plan draft report and presentation. We will have a presentation first from Patrick Darby, Energy and Carbon Team Manager, and Caden Toffolo, and Energy Engineering Intern of Water Feddy. Please go ahead with your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen, so just give me a second to get that set up. Okay, can everyone in the office see the presentation? Good. Okay, great. So, like you mentioned there, thanks very much for the introduction and having us this evening. I'm the team manager of Energy and Carbon Solutions at Walter Fady, and Caden, my counterpart here, works with me on our team in Energy and Carbon Solutions as a energy engineering intern. So we've been tasked over the past many number of months to create the update for the Energy Conservation Demand Management Plan for Aurora. And this is an update on the progress as we move to final completion. So we have about a 30 to 40 minute presentation, plus or minus a few minutes in that range to provide to you tonight. Happy to take questions when it's appropriate. So during, if there's anything that's right on the top of your mind, feel free to jump in, or we can also take questions at the end as well.
So we'll probably do the questions at the end.
Perfect. Sounds good. So in terms of the goals, this is the second Energy Conservation Demand Management Plan. The previous version of that was completed for July of 2019. So that represented the previous 5 years. This is an update to the plan for 2024 to 2029. In particular, we focused on 3 areas: short term, 2025 to 2030, medium term, 2030 to 2035, and long term, 2035 to 2050. So those are the primary targets that we worked on for this energy conservation and management plan update. In terms of where we are at for project milestones, we are on the final stage of the project. So that's milestone number 7, final reporting and presentations. It's been a fairly comprehensive project involving various stakeholder engagement sessions of the facilities, fleet, wastewater, public lighting departments, and has gone through 7 steps. The first step was kickoff and development of the work plan. Then we worked through 3 kind of primary content deliverables, which we call technical memorandums, where it was content progress updates with respect to the developments of the project. So those are steps 2, 4, and 6. And steps 2 and 3 were a lot of the details, where steps 2, we're performing market research and detailed analytics on the energy and carbon impacting infrastructure of Aurora. And step number 5, where we developed the plan in detail and created recommendations out of that plan. So we'll go into a bit of background on the project and some of the details on the regulatory side. So this ECDMP is a requirement of OREG 25-23, where all public agencies, including municipalities, are required to develop their reports for the next 5 years. This is due at the end of June. So we're in a good position now to work through the final few steps of the project, which includes integration coordination with EAC, as well as a council presentation in June as well. So what's new to this plan? There's something called PCP Milestone 3. So that's a framework which has been developed, which municipalities comply to work through overarching milestones. There's 5 major milestones. First one is inventorying. Second one is setting targets. Third one is developing the plan. Fourth one is implementing the plan. And 5 is to continuously monitor the impacts of those plans. Well, in clarification of what this plan is, the focus of this plan is on the corporate side, not the community side. The community side is much more detailed and can be complicated to really wrap your arms around. But this is really focused on the corporate emissions of Aurora. This is a general comparison of the community versus corporate. So in terms of the corporate assets, we've focused on the town-owned facilities as well as fleet, and then GHG, or greenhouse gas emissions, associated with solid waste. Furthermore, street lighting and public lighting, as well as water and wastewater. So you'll see in subsequent slides that the overall impact of carbon on each of those 5 bullet points varies quite significantly, depending on their scope 1 or scope 2 or scope 3 emissions impact. I think this is a really interesting slide. It shows that the annual GHG emissions is approximately 3,000 equivalent tons of CO2 per year, where the community of Aurora is 326,000 tons per year. So even though the corporate assets represent about 1% of the entire profile of the community, the corporate leadership is very key to demonstrate so that there's significant buy-in on the community side. So I think we all appreciate that the corporation demonstrating as leaders will hopefully impact that other 99% significantly as well. So in terms of targeting, there's previous targets that were established in the previous Energy Conservation Demand Management Plan from 2019, particularly around a goal of 80% reduction in GHG emissions by 2050. There was a 16% reduction goal by 2023 from the 2018 baseline. And then to note, the community energy plan had a 22% reduction in GHG emissions by 2030 and a parallel 80% reduction by 2050. So there's been lots of discussion and development which has happened over the past 5 years. There's a lot of more shift towards that full net zero GHG emissions by 2050. So we did look at that as part of the considerations, and which would be an update with respect to the 2019 goal for 2050. IPCC, which is all tailored around maintaining that 1.5 degrees temperature rise of the planet, and a science-based approach, has recommended targets toward 48% by 2030, which is a significant challenge, but probably most importantly, long-term achieving net zero by 2050. So to align with the practical nature of implementing projects, the targets that have been established are the 20% reduction by 2030, a 50% reduction by 2035, and net zero by 2050. So we'll get into some of the details of what that means. But we just first wanted to highlight some of the performance that's happened over the past 5 years, which is quite exciting to see. If you look at the bottom line here, that's the kind of primary figure, which is representative of the overall impact. So in 2018, the overall emissions were about 3,900 tons. And in 2022, it was down to about 3,100. So some great progress has been made at the town of Aurora on their corporate emissions, and that's to the range of 20% reduction as an aggregate. One of the key things to note with those particular years is this is not just the impacts of COVID. So the primary COVID impact years that we often put asterisks on are 2020 and 2021 data, with showing that 2022 had such strong overall performance kind of reflects some of the initiatives that have been happening within Aurora. So this is certainly something to celebrate within the EAC group and the larger stakeholders who impact corporate emissions. Oh, just switching slides here. We certainly have a lot of data which has been analyzed in a lot more detail, so I won't go through specific numbers that you're seeing here, but this is a little bit more granularity on what's led to those reductions of 20%. In particular, there's been a significant reduction in natural gas usage, which is the HVAC systems for building heating. Is your primary consumer of natural gas, along with domestic hot water for potable water heating within buildings. So almost a 30% reduction in carbon from those components. There was some slight changes in others where had the opposite impacts, kind of resulting in the net 20%. So you can see above here, electricity consumption also went down by 10%. And fleet emissions by 50%. Oh, sorry, back to the target. Okay, I will now hand it over to Kaden to talk a little bit about the sector-based breakdown of Aurora's corporate emission profile.
Thanks, Patrick. Okay, so this slide shows like a pie chart, and it breaks down the percentage of GHG emissions for each different asset type that we've been considering in the plan. And this shows kind of the most recent 2022 data. So the key thing I want to pull your attention to is the buildings are currently responsible for 67% of the town of Aurora's corporate emissions. So this is always something we like to look at, because seeing which assets are responsible for the greatest percentage of GHG emissions helps us to know where to focus our efforts as we're developing a plan. So seeing that buildings are responsible for 2/3 of the town's GHG emissions really highlights that all of the GHG emissions from buildings should be the main focus to help the town of Aurora achieve its climate change targets. The next highest contributor was, oh, sorry, Patrick, can you go back
Yep.
quickly? Thanks. The next highest contributor was the corporate fleet, which was responsible for about 18% of the emissions, followed by the waste sector, which was about 13% of the emissions. And then, as you can see, public lighting was only about 2%, and the pumping stations were less than 0.1%. And the line isn't even visible on this chart. So public lighting and pumping stations are going to be less of a priority as we develop the plan. Okay, you can move to the next slide now. Thank you. So to break it down a little bit more, this plot shows some of the subcategories within each asset type to compare their respective GHG emissions. So by far, the highest contributor to GHG emissions for the town was indoor recreation facilities. This is because the recreational facilities are often large buildings which require quite a bit of space heating, which burns natural gas. And then you also have other processes such as, refrigeration, heating pools, and this will burn, a lot of natural gas, consume a lot of electricity, and results in the highest GHG emissions. So we really want to be focusing on that as we develop the plan. Otherwise, the other building types were also fairly high contributors. And then, building waste disposal was the third highest contributor, which shows that basically the corporate solid waste that was collected from corporate-owned buildings was the highest contributor from within the waste category. And then the GHG emissions due to fleet were sort of spread out between the different kinds of assets, between equipment, light duty, medium duty, and heavy duty, although heavy duty did show slightly higher GHG emissions than the other categories. All right, next slide. Thank you. So in this slide and the next one, I'm also going to touch on the utility use trends for electricity and natural gas over the past few years. So on this slide, we are showing the electricity trends from 2015 to 2022. For the most part, these trends have remained fairly consistent over the years. As Patrick was mentioning earlier, in 2020, you can see a significant decrease in the electricity consumed, which is most likely due to the effects of reduced operation during COVID-19. In 2021, it's a little bit higher, but still lower than normal. And then by 2022, it's returned to a very similar level to what it had pre-2020, which suggests that these buildings had resumed normal operations by this point. Next slide. And then as for natural gas, we're also showing the trends from 2015 to 2022. There was a gradual increase in natural gas consumption from 2015 to 2019. This is partially related to having a little bit more data in recent years, and also the town of Aurora has acquired new buildings and new assets, such as the sports dome, which are now being considered in part of the scope, which increase the overall, observed GHG emissions in these years. By 2020, there was a decrease in the natural gas consumption, which was likely at the very least impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. But again, as Patrick was mentioning earlier, in 2021 and 2022, the natural gas consumption just continued to drop even as the operations would have resumed to normal. So that's going to be the impact of all of the measures that the town of Aurora has been implementing to reduce GHG emissions, which shows really good progress in that area and is responsible for the considerable drop in GHG emissions due to natural gas that have been occurring since 2018. Next slide. So now we're going to switch gears and we're going to be talking about some of the GHG reduction plans, or we've broken it down based on the asset type. Next slide. So first, we're going to talk about facilities, and I'm just going to start by giving a little bit of background on this slide, I'll just give some background on the different facilities which are being considered in the scope of this, 2024 update to the ECDMP. So for the facilities, we're considering 3 different facility types. So we have the administrative offices, the indoor recreation facilities, and the public facilities. The middle column shows the different buildings that are being considered as part of the plan. And then the column on the right shows the percentage of corporate GHG emissions. And this represents the percentage of, the overall corporate GHG emissions. So the total of all of these buildings come to 67% because that was the percentage that the buildings were responsible for. I want to highlight the middle type, the indoor recreation facilities, because each of these facilities was individually responsible for at least 5% of the town's GHG emissions in 2022. And the SARC was responsible for 31% of GHG emissions. So that one recreation complex was responsible for almost a third of the town of Aurora's GHG emissions all on its own. So that helps to show that, the SARC should be one of the foremost buildings as we're looking at different ways to reduce the town's GHG emissions. Most of the other buildings are, contribute to 1 to 2% of the town of Aurora's GHG emissions, although the Joint Operations Center was responsible for 9%. So that's another building that would be useful to target with different measures as we're trying to develop a plan to reduce the town's GHG emissions. Next slide. Thank you. So the projects from 2019 to 2024, there have been several LED retrofits that have been completed over the years, which has helped to decrease the energy consumption at these buildings. The Aurora Public Library has had several projects done, including demand control ventilation and replacing the rooftop HVAC system. So these can help to make sure that your space heating system is as efficient as possible, and you're being as efficient with your uses of natural gas as possible so that you can cut down on your GHG emissions from space heating. And there have also been additional building operational optimization changes, which were run through the Enbridge Run It Right program, which have all contributed to decreasing the town of Aurora's GHG emissions over this period. There are also some measures in progress, such as, more LED retrofits. For instance, some buildings have done the first couple floors and are just waiting on retrofitting that last floor. There are a few buildings where they're in the progress of replacing, upgrading HVAC equipment, and they're considering arena low E ceilings to reduce energy lost through the arenas. And there are other measures planned, such as low flow water fixtures, occupancy sensors to reduce the energy use if there's no one in a certain room, and then other ways of optimizing the HVAC system to reduce your space heating. So
Thanks, Kate.
I'll pass it over to Patrick to talk a bit more about the plan.
Thanks, Kaden. So now we'll get into the short, medium, and long-term plans for the facilities, starting with short-term plans. So on the 2024 to 2029 plan, there's a number of measures to be planned on, implemented over that time period. They involve things like demand control ventilation at a number of those facilities that Kaden mentioned, finishing off the lighting retrofits to LED to significantly reduce the energy required to provide electricity to lights. A large, and I will note, just want to note one thing, you do see a negative 25 GHG reductions. That is due to the fact that when you're moving from a kind of high intensity light to an LED, the heat is no longer dissipated from the light. So there's often additional heating requirements of those buildings, and that has a kind of negative GHG impact. That being said, in terms of a utility cost perspective and simple payback, those projects are extremely positive and reduced operational costs quite significantly. The next item is to implement those measures that were identified and planned for from the 2019 ECDMP, having about a 60-ton reduction in GHG. So it's going to continue the momentum and progress built from that plan. There's some occupancy sensors with some small impacts. A big item here is to replace the remaining fixtures to low flow. That will have almost a 200-ton reduction in carbon, as not nearly as much potable water needs to be heated to achieve that. And then there's a few more in addition to that one around pool covers at rec centers to avoid evaporation and keep the heating energy within the pool. And then replacing boilers for high efficiency boilers and an optimum start to stop. So that's around controllability. So there's a number of things which are quantifiable in the 2024 to 2029 plan, both that have been momentum built up from the previous plan, but also new things that have been identified through this refresh and coordination with the stakeholders over the number of workshops. One interesting item to note as well is around ice resurfacers, which is the bottom line here, and that's to start to build up replacing propane-based ice resurfacing equipment with electric-based ice resurfacing equipment. There's also some other positive outcomes of that, as you no longer have the exhaust gases into the general arena space, as the propane equipment is no longer firing into that large open space. So the exhaust requirements are not required as well. So that's something which is quite a positive move as well, as it kind of relates to the fleet side. And there's also a number of additional additional recommendations for the facilities over these next 5 years, which we don't have a detailed quantifiable carbon reduction, but really set this table for the medium and long-term reductions. So one in particular is to follow the FCM framework for GHG reduction pathway feasibility studies. And that is kind of related to targeting those larger GHG emitting facilities and doing a comprehensive study, which there's significant funding to do the studies on each of the facilities. And then through those feasibility studies, a detailed plan will be established to do major reductions and retrofits of those facilities. So an example of that is the feasibility study for a recreational center or one of the other buildings may be done, and it will establish like a zero carbon retrofit of that facility and a plan to make that happen. And that might yield the one facility almost a 31%. So perhaps 90% of that facility's GHG emissions may be eliminated sometime in the 2030s, as an example. So there's a number of things in addition to the quantifiable on-site implementations, like these feasibility studies, like energy audits, triaging, more detailed costing as it relates to measures which could be implemented across facilities, which will be happening over the next 5 years as well. So that's kind of a key initiative, which really helps set the table for the medium and long-term success. In terms of medium term, which kind of general recommendation of measures which will occur where you're seeing significant carbon reductions. The two with the most significant impacts, both around 500 tons, are to electrify and transition to a heat pump technology for domestic hot water heating at facilities, as well as the primary buildings HVAC systems and the heating systems. So the advantage and why you see such significant reductions when you're transitioning to heat pump is not only Is it electric, where our grid has a much lower grid intensity? Heat pumps also use almost 3 times less energy than a traditional natural gas firing appliance. So you have kind of a layering effect to significantly decarbonize the heating requirements of both water and air for a building. In addition to those measures, there's a number of other components here around electrification of ice resurfacing boilers, increasing building envelope roof thicknesses, considering low E coating, low E ceiling for the arenas to reflect the cold temperature back down to the ice surface compared to having to heat as much. Electrification of dehumidification, moving pool heating to heat pumps. And then there's one item here around VVT or VAV. Those are just HVAC system considerations as well. One thing to note is you do often see negative utility cost reductions associated with some of these measures. That's just to do with the fact that natural gas is a much less expensive energy than electricity when you compare it on a per unit of energy basis. And this is something which is very sensitive to cost escalations and costs of natural gas, electricity, the carbon tax, things like that. From a long-term plan perspective, it's maintaining some of that momentum on the electrification of domestic hot water and HVAC, as well as integration of something like solar PV generation, so on-site renewables, and then kind of finishing off the final electrification of any items that are still consuming natural gas, like dehumidification. Okay, I'll pass it back to Kaden to introduce the fleet side.
Thanks, Patrick. So the next slide that we're going to be looking at is the fleet. So the fleet contributed to about 18% of the town's GHG emissions. We look at various operational areas, including bylaw facilities, parks, roads, and water wastewater related vehicles. And we have different categories of assets, including equipment, light duty, medium duty, and heavy duty, where often the heavy duty equipment will have the highest individual GHG emissions. But since lighter equipment such as lawnmowers might be used very frequently, as we saw earlier, all of the categories have similar contributions to the town's GHG emissions overall. So looking at some of the projects which have been completed for the fleet from 2019 to 2024, there have been various victories in this area. So an anti-idling initiative was developed, as well as a green fleet action plan to kind of develop a plan and suggest various measures which can be implemented to reduce the GHG emissions coming from fleet. There have been programs to measure the distance traveled and record the fuel consumed by fleet vehicles, consider opportunities to upgrade different town-owned fleet vehicles, and various electric ice resurfacers and hybrid SUVs have been purchased recently, as well as higher tier diesel engines being used to replace any lower tier diesel equipment. And ethanol 10 has been incorporated into gasoline fueled vehicles, ethanol 10 being a blend of ethanol and gasoline, which has lower GHG emissions intensity per liter fuel burned. In addition to this, an ongoing project is to resize the fleet and dispose of antiquated equipment, just to make sure that the fleet is as efficient as possible and burns as few GHG emissions as possible.
Thanks, Kaden. In terms of the short-term plan for the fleet, there's 3 primary items. The first is decarbonization of ice resurfacing, so that's moving from propane to electric. And the second 2 items are decarbonization of 2 vehicles, So that would likely be replacement of 2 vehicles with an electric version of that vehicle, and also decarbonization of 10 pieces of equipment. So that would be replacing those pieces of equipment which are currently consuming fossil fuels with electric versions of those equipment. This touches on some of those initiatives where that Caden was just mentioning in terms of the positive momentum which have happened, and also continuing to take actions which are aligned with them in particular. Also here we're mentioning a focus on employee training for operations and maintenance of newer technologies, as we appreciate that as new vehicles are coming online which are electric, there's new operating procedures and processes which will need to be considered around charging, as an example, and making sure that there's enough capacity to support the general operations of those pieces of equipment or vehicles. In the medium term, it's kind of maintain those momentum with larger scale equipment decarbonization. So focusing on full electric replacement of those pieces of equipment. And on the long-term side, it's the wholesale kind of replacement on the light vehicle side towards electric vehicles. We think that these measures will kind of generally align with when these pieces of or these components will need to be replaced, and the availability of electric technologies which have low carbon impacts will be significant. So it should be a marginal cost or marginal capital cost impact to move towards these solutions long term. Okay, I'll flip it back to Caden to speak on waste.
Thanks, Patrick. So switching gears to talk about the waste. So this is the first ECDMP where we're including waste as part of the scope to be fulfilling the PCP milestones 1 through 3. There's been a preliminary waste audit done to estimate the GHG emissions due to waste, which can give us an idea of where they're coming from and help to develop a plan for this. So when I talk about the town's emissions due to solid waste, I'm referring to downstream emissions that are associated with either landfilling or incinerating waste generated by the town's corporate activities. Any solid waste that's sent to landfill will produce GHGs such as methane. And from this, we've seen that the town's solid waste contributed 13% to its corporate emissions. So looking at the corporate waste, this includes waste from any corporate-owned buildings, such as, the SARC or AFLC, and this contributed to 71% of the town's GHG emissions from solid waste. This also includes waste collected from parks and public receptacles, where, parks receptacles contributed to 28% of the waste, and public receptacles contributed to 2% of the waste within the scope of this plan. Also, something I want to mention regarding waste. Recently, the town has started a dog diversion program, which has, different receptacles being set up to divert dog waste from any public receptacles so they can be sent to a facility and repurposed to fuel to help to, cut down on some of that waste contamination and, make sure that the waste is being used as effectively as possible. The waste that we're considering in this plan is managed by the region, and it's sent to either one of 2 landfill sites or one of 3 waste to energy centers in York Region. So, from a GHG emissions calculation standpoint, it's difficult to know, exactly how much, how many tons of CO2 or, the equivalent CO2 in GHG emissions are being contributed to from waste. And this is sort of an issue that many municipalities are having to tackle. So for our purposes, we assumed that about 50% of the waste generated was sent to landfill, and the other 50% was sent to a waste to energy program. And from there, calculated the waste contributions to emissions based on the PCP protocol. So looking into a short-term plan for waste, One of the recommendations is to perform regular solid waste audits. It's awesome that at this point we have some data to work with, but performing regular solid waste audits can help to better understand the contributions and trends for solid waste, and also can help as we start, implementing measures to monitor any progress that's being made, so that you can make sure you're seeing the expected improvements based on any actions that you're taking. Another recommendation that we have is to develop a waste reduction plan. So this can entail several items, such as, increasing the focus on different reuse activities, having increased availability and education for the recycling and organics bins to hopefully, cut down on any contamination and ensure that you're diverting as much waste through recycling and organics as possible. Reduce the use of single-use items. Make sure that you're continuously researching the best green procurement practices and abiding by them, and investigating opportunities to promote a circular economy and cut down on the overall waste as well. So the long-term goals for GHG reductions from this plan, in the short term, we're mostly focusing on, developing these plans and performing regular audits. And we're hoping that by implementing these plans in the long term, you can see about 10% reductions in GHG emissions due to waste. And in the long term, the goal is to achieve net zero GHG emissions due to solid waste. So the next asset to touch on is public lighting. There's not too much to say about this since it contributes to about 2% of the town's GHG emissions, but public lighting represents the electricity being consumed from streetlights, park lights, and traffic lights. There are about 4,800 streetlights within the jurisdiction, and most were retrofitted to LED by 2018. Some recommendations for conservation measures to investigate are to review all existing public lighting and determine whether there are any additional opportunities to retrofit lights to LED. When we talk to some of the stakeholders from this area, it sounds like there are a couple stretches which still don't have LED lights, as well as some, like field lighting isn't LED. So by converting any of these lights to LED, that could help to reduce GHG emissions from lighting to an even smaller percentage of what it already is. And the last asset to discuss is the water and wastewater sector. So this considers the electricity that's being consumed by the pumping stations throughout the town, and it contributes to about less than 0.1% of the town's GHG emissions. So there are 10 pumping stations being considered in the scope of this plan, and although this sector isn't as necessary to investigate as some of the larger ones like buildings, some recommendations are to investigate the pumping stations for opportunities to reduce energy use, such as installing variable frequency drives on the pumps to save on that energy as much as possible, and to consider measuring any GHG emissions related to the pumping station generators as well for future plans.
Thanks, Kaden. Final item on recommendations kind of aligned with different measures across the asset pool. We've got 5 or 6 bullet points here. First one is around doing energy performance monitoring. So that's ensuring we're looking at energy on an active basis and it's being well monitored, such that any impacts of measures which are implemented, the results can be measured and verified, as well as when you're seeing unusual energy patterns happening, you're able to act on those compared to waiting for a bill to arrive or an annual report to come through. Next item is around life cycle cost analysis. So that's making sure that within budgeting, planning and asset management, that kind of a detailed life cycle cost analysis has been completed, which considers incremental upgrades with low carbon solutions compared to like-for-like replacement or otherwise. Next step is around development of a sustainable building standard for new constructions and major renovations. So this is aligned with what a number of municipalities have been doing to make sure that that's kind of a key criteria when dollars are being invested in infrastructure. The next item here is to investigate low carbon electric generation opportunities at facilities or otherwise. This could be around solar PV generation on a rooftop or something similar to that. We really see those as, last line of defense just before carbon offsets, which is the last item listed here, focusing on conservation first, electrification, decarbonization, and then the final items would be first generation on-site generation, and then the final item is carbon offset. So just before we touch on carbon offsets, maintaining kind of research into new technologies. I think we all appreciate that it's a long time between now and 2050. That's 26 years. So what happens in certainly the long term will be impacted significantly by technology developments, and also somewhat in the medium term. So keeping our ears to the ground, understanding where these opportunities are to integrate technology advancements to support GHG reduction is important. And then just as I mentioned, the carbon offset side, there's been a budget established on 2035 and 2050. Hopefully that's, we can minimize that as much as possible, because the focus has been on the facilities, fleets, lighting, etc., assets themselves. One additional recommendation is around change management. So the recommendation to develop a steering committee, which meets quite regularly throughout the year to guide the town through these operational shifts, which will have to happen. Recommendations around involvement of senior leadership. And then we put kind of a few key roles that we think would be quite positive to have as part of that steering committee, which are people in this room, and then some others as well. So we'll now kind of move to kind of wrap everything up with respect to the overarching plan and some visualization around that. So we have two figures here. The figure on the left is kind of the business as planned or business as usual. This is likely what's going to happen if EAC Group didn't exist. GHG energy conservation initiatives weren't a priority. We would see a steady increase in GHG emissions through to 2050. That's kind of associated with replacement of equipment, increase in the town of Aurora size, increase in other usages which may happen. So you can see that on the left side, the top dash line, just for your reference, is the 2018 baseline. And then the three dash lines beneath those represent a line which would establish a 30% reduction, a 50% reduction, and an 80% reduction. So you can see the figure on the left is not the plan, but it's a great reference point to this is what would happen if we weren't taking initiatives. In terms of the actual plan, you can see that with the figure on the right, where there's a steady kind of decrease in the overall GHG impact. We've broken this down by the actual energy use or utility use. So if you look at kind of the light blue, which represents natural gas, you can see that there's significant decrease in the overall gas usage over time. If you look at kind of the yellow bar, which represents electricity, you're actually seeing an increase in GHG emissions associated with electricity, because there's significant items which will be moved from fossil fuel burning to electricity, where the overall energy use of electricity is going to increase. In terms of the impacts of GHGs on electricity, it's very dependent on our carbon grid intensity of Ontario. We do have a relatively low carbon grid intensity, but there is significant active and ongoing discussions with the IESO on, decarbonization of the grid overall. So as an example, if you look at that yellow bar, and let's say the IESO moves to full grid decarbonization, the GHG emissions associated with those measures would virtually merge towards zero long term. So this is a resilient plan because it has a GHG emissions factor built in, but is flexible for decrease because the Aurora will see the positive outcomes if that's decreased long term. And I just populated the bars which represent 2035 and 2050 targeting. This is a plot, businesses plan versus GHG reduction plan with respect to utility costs. So it's expected things to increase in a businesses plan scenario. That's with cost escalation associated with the energy usages. We've certainly seen a lot of cost escalation in utilities over the past few years in particular, but you can see the overall operational cost impacts in the GHG reduction plan compared to business as usual are much lighter. So almost a kind of a 25% reduction in overall operational utility costs when moving from the GHG reduction plan from the business as usual. In terms of kind of numbers with respect to what's targeted originally in 2018, so there's a 20% reduction target by 2030, 50% by 2035, and 2050 was net zero. You can see with respect to the plan right now, that is at 2042 and 63. There's a lot of focus here on decarbonization of primary heating sources and fossil fuel consumption associated with fleet. We see that there is kind of a gap to bridge, but we do see those as very practical gaps to bridge as well. We know that there's going to be significant measures identified as part of those feasibility studies, those FCM funded feasibility studies, which will happen over the next 5 years, which will allow additional reductions in facilities operations in particular. And we know long-term with technology advancements, life cycle of vehicles and equipment that will enable additional long-term fleet reduction as well. So although the true nature of the actual quantifiable numbers of the plan right now are 42 and 63 and 2035 and 2050 respectively, we recognize that there's strong means to bridge those gaps towards those medium and long-term plans. So that concludes the formal side of the presentation. Thank you for bearing with us. We do recognize that there is a significant amount of content to work through.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that was a really big presentation. Lot to unpack there, but we've got time to talk about it, so don't worry, we've got time. I guess first things first, we do need to have a mover and seconder to put the item on the floor for discussion. And with the recommendation of one, that the memorandum regarding the 2024 Energy Conservation and Demand Management Plan draft report presentation be received. And two, that the Environmental Advisory Committee comments regarding this plan be received and referred to staff for consideration and further action. May I have a mover and a seconder for that? Okay, Kristen and Pipette. All right, Natalie, I'm going to open the floor to you first. If you have any comments about this plan before I open up to the committee.
No, just an overall comment. Thank you, Patrick and Kaden. That was a great presentation. A lot of information, as you can see. So thank you for presenting that. They did note this at the beginning of the presentation, but this is a significant overhaul of our previous corporate energy plans from the past 2014 and 2019 plans. So this really is considered a complete GHG inventory using best practices, as I mentioned, the PCP framework. It brought about a lot of challenges about collecting all this data that we've never collected before or never tracked it. And it also brings challenges about tracking it going forward, because we want to be adding this to our annual reporting, in addition to tracking all of our projects that were identified through here. So it does bring about a lot of new challenges, but as you can see from the presentation, there still is so much opportunity for us, you know, to find these reduction opportunities, like the waste audits and putting together a waste reduction plan that currently we don't have corporate wide, for example. So, you know, and then also with fleet, we've seen a lot of progress. They had a lot of challenges in our last 5-year plan, just collecting data. And they've made so much improvement in the last 5 years in terms of gathering and tracking their fuel consumption and kilometers and stuff. So we've seen a lot of improvement there, though we haven't necessarily seen the greenhouse gas emission reductions in that period. The management of those emissions is drastically changed. And now we need to go to the next phase of you know, decarbonization of the fleet, right? So, so yeah, I think they did a great job. One note actually I wanted to bring up. So they pointed out that we had a like almost 30% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from our natural gas use from our facilities. Meanwhile, our electricity use only decreased 2%. So one point to make is that in this time frame, we've acquired new properties. And when you're acquiring new properties, you're just adding to your emission profile. So something to consider in the future as we grow as a municipality and in our operations, these new acquisitions, new considerations should be taken through those acquisition processes, that they do have an impact on our inventory. And those new assets that we acquired in that time period are specifically electricity intensive properties. And so they kind of degraded our electricity reduction successes in that period of time. We don't see that in the overall numbers because we just added more properties, right? So those successes kind of got lost, right? So going forward, I know they had one of the recommendations to have or to develop a sustainable building standard for new builds and major constructions. Well, that kind of plays into it because if the town plans to build any new facilities, you know, again, that is increasing our emissions, right? And so we need to set a building standard that's more rigid than we have been in the past in terms of emission impacts. So yeah, I think those were my only comments.
That's great. Thank you very much, Ms. Keel.
Okay.
Appreciate it. I'll
Yeah.
open up the floor to the committee for comments on this project. By all means, we'll have time for at least a few from you because I know this is a big project and I'm sure more questions will come up. Any questions or comments?
I have one small question.
Papette?
Yeah. How did, I guess in this plan, so we're looking for the futures, we know we have a large building coming from the town. Has that already been incorporated into the plan? Town Square, that whole project?
Natalie?
Through you, Madam Chair, I'll take this one, Patrick, because so Town Square, since we have, yes and no. So the design of Town Square, they did try to follow LEED Gold standard.
Okay.
As a building standard. And in the past, that is the standard that the town has been trying to follow. So they did, our Joint Operations Center also followed the same standard and got it certified for LEED Gold. Which is great and is a huge step forward. But when we're speaking of greenhouse gas emissions, this type of standard doesn't focus necessarily just on emissions. And so you can still have a fairly energy intensive building and have it, LEED Gold or LEED Silver. Because you can opt for other design features that are also very important, like environmental, like water conservation and other features. So Town Square did follow that design standard. But again, it wasn't focused necessarily on greenhouse gas emission reductions. So going forward, that's, I think, where we should be thinking about is when we do these major constructions, what kind of standard, should we maintain that standard or should we think a little bit differently for future designs if we're trying to get to net zero? So the answer is yes, it was considered, but just not, it wasn't the focus, right? So there are a lot of other great elements on the project. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Keel. Pippa, any other
No,
follow-up to that?
thank
No?
you.
You're good? Any other questions? Nicole?
I have a question. So I'm happy to see the change in the targets. So very happy to see those. While it's not overly progressive, it's at least meeting the standards. So really happy about that. I have a question. Why was 2018 used as the baseline? And is it because of the lack of data before 2018 or?
That's right. Yeah, so when they came up with the 2019 ECDMP, they used the latest complete set of data that they had, and that was the 2018 year. Yeah.
Nicole? Any other follow-up?
I have a couple of other questions.
Sure.
Okay.
Yep.
One of the questions or one of the things in the slides I didn't understand was the pumping station. It says that there was an 11% reduction between 2018 to 2022, but there was no actual changes. So I was a bit confused on how that
Patrick?
happened.
Is that your wheelhouse, Patrick?
In slide,
On the
You're-
pumping house?
The pumping stations for water, wastewater?
yeah, there was like an 11% reduction, but then there's no percentage changes.
Yeah, I can actually feel that it's the 11% reduction. It's, difficult to see because, the pumping station emissions are so low to begin with. And, we were rounding the data. So rounded, it looks like they have, the same tons of equivalent CO2 emissions per year. But if you looked at, a more detailed breakdown of the numbers with like more significant figures, then you would actually see an 11% reduction. It just is kind of hidden in rounding the numbers.
Yeah, it's basically not a significant digit on how we completed it because there's like 3,900 tons of carbon and pumping stations were represented one, and then that's how the rounding happened. So if we expanded that a little bit more, and my equivalent would be like a 1.0 and a 0.91. But rounded, those were both one.
Thank you, Patrick and Caden. Follow-up questions?
I'll let other people because I see other hands up. So
Okay.
I'll come back.
Come back? Okay. Counselor Gardner?
Thank you. Does anybody else from the committee want to ask questions or comments?
Well, do you want to go, Dennis?
No, Councilor Gardner, go first, then I'll take my turn.
Oh, okay.
Counselor Gardner, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So, congratulations on the improvements, Natalie. I know you didn't do it single-handedly. So there's some things I want to mention. Most importantly to me we're depending very heavily on electricity. And I'm not sure how reliable the electricity grid is. So that worries me a lot. I'm disappointed that there's no, I mean, I wish we were using alternative methods. We were being more curious and looking into other ways of producing energy. With respect to the Joint Operations Center, I was surprised to know that it's responsible for 9% of the GHE and GHG. That's a fairly new building, and we did build it to a high standard. So that's very disappointing, notwithstanding your comments about the gold standard reflects many things, not only energy. With respect to the Aurora Family Leisure Complex, it's a building I know very well. People are using space heaters at their desks. So that, the heat is on. Actually, they're even using them sometimes in the summer. So, Natalie, I don't know what we can do about that. I know at the town hall, it's just our buildings weren't built very well. And when staff have to resort to portable heaters to keep warm, the town hall also, it has that big atrium ceiling on the third floor. I don't know if anybody's been to any events on the third floor. It's a huge, in the summer, we've got the sun shining in on that, so the air conditioning use is high. In the winter, we have a lot of heat escaping from there. I've talked about it at the council table. Until we can change the mindset. Also with the occupancy sensors, Rachel, I don't know if you've noticed this, but those rooms stay lit a long time after people leave. I spoke to Ms. McDougall about it. Yeah, they do go off eventually, but they take a long time. And the other thing that, one of the other things is we have to look at personal habits. When I go into the town hall on the weekend, there's always a lot of lights on. So we have to have buy-in from the staff. And I don't see it. So I'm glad to know that we're going to be monitoring these things, because we need people to take responsibility for monitoring how we're doing from week to week or month to month. That's all for the moment. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Gertner. Ms. Keel, I don't know if you or Patrick or Kane wants to take the question about the other energy sources. I don't see any comments about hydrogen or solar or wind, and I know there's probably some good reasons why, but maybe if somebody wants to chime in, Patrick, is that something that you wanted to?
Certainly on the energy sources, it was one of the recommendations is to look into kind of alternative lower or decarbonized sources of energy. That would be things like potentially hydrogen. I know Enbridge Gas and the government have a big program kind of looking into detail into hydrogen. Microgrids could be part of that, so locally established microgrids. A lot of those initiatives would particularly land in that longer term standpoint because the cost to kind of create kind of local kind of larger scale energy sources would be very significant. So there's kind of having that in the short term plan didn't make sense, but certainly kind of understand that this is potentially part of long-term solutions where there is more kind of local microgrids type arrangement, particularly if there's a cluster of buildings that can make sense, in particular where there's some diversity with just residential use and then operational use as well. And in terms of kind of reliability, certainly we are kind of reliant on the IESO and their maintenance of our grid. So there's certainly consideration that we are relying on that. And in terms of the Joint Operations Center, we can take a double check on the actual energy intensity of that building as it compares to other buildings as well, just to see how it's performing in particular. So the 9%, we can put that number into context just to see the performance there. And then the other kind of final item is certainly education and training on of occupants of buildings is a key consideration for long-term performance of the buildings. So how people engage with the buildings, the users experience the buildings, what can be integrated from a building management perspective, like a building like automation perspective, to ensure that kind of users can't just leave lights on if the space isn't occupied for 3 days, to that level of detail. So those are certainly considerations as part of this, which those feasibility studies will dig into and more. So I think in a number of comments that there's areas that they can be addressed as part of the long-term plan.
Thank you, Patrick. And as far as the atrium, are there reflective products that are innovative that could be applied to the atrium that might deflect the sun and the heat outwards? Is that something that we should be considering in the town hall?
Sorry, what was the question on, or sorry, I think I missed the details of the question on the
okay.
atrium.
Councillor Gardner was just responding about the atrium on the town hall, like the top floor is all glass, and that she didn't see any proactive recommendations to make change there. So I didn't know if you took note to it. Perhaps maybe there's a product that would reflect off of glass that you could apply. I don't know if that's something that you considered when you're looking at the buildings. I think that was the question from Councillor Gardner.
Yeah, so certainly different areas to manage that. So we generally want to take advantage of the sun as much as possible. The sun is such a huge asset to managing our buildings. So having appropriate shading at certain times. So we want to kind of reflect the sun during the summer months to decrease the amount of solar heat gain in the space, but also encourage the sun in the winter months to kind of gain that solar energy. So there's technologies where we have kind of dampered shading devices. We could also look at potential replacement of that, glazing. And then there's something called electrochromatic glazing, where you can actually control the glazing in terms of its opaque. It can go from fully clear to fully dark, and that can be automated based on the cloud coverage, the time of day, the season, etc. So kind of the specifics, feasibilities of that will be dug into in more detail as part of those audits and feasibility studies.
Perfect. Councillor Gardner, does that answer most of your questions?
Thank you. I have a few more, but I'll wait until everybody's asked theirs.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Councillor Gardner. Dennis, and then Shun, we'll go after Dennis. Go ahead.
Great. Through the chair, thank you very much for the presentation. As a data person, I was really excited to kind of see your slides 36, 37, and 38, and those are the ones that I'm hoping to concentrate on for my questions. I noticed that on slide 30, I guess 6, with regards to the businesses planned and your modeling to compare that with the GHG reduction plan. I am wondering, I just wanted to confirm, was one of your, I guess, assumptions in the modeling, I guess, a zero gain of assets throughout the years from, I guess, when he started the modeling up to 2050?
Patrick, is this your wheelhouse?
Yeah, I think we can respond to that. So we don't have like specific significant buildings coming online that we have kind of long-term vision on. So we haven't like assumed, X number of buildings at certain years as an example.
Okay, great. So through the chair, thank you. I think that echoes, I guess, Natalie's comments about how with the acquisition of new buildings or this model will change. But then again, I would expect the modeling to change with new information coming in.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, and if you noted one of the recommendations was to develop the design standard for new constructions and major renovations and potential acquisitions. So one of the, like, let's say you're building a new facility, that standard, sustainable building standard, could suggest that any new facility shall be a net zero facility. So with that happening, it would actually then have no impact on the GHG plan for the town. So that would be like one area where, yes, it will change because there's more building, but it will have no net increase in GHGs. So we've, in a couple of our other clients, we've actually had them take a couple buildings offline and then replace those buildings with a new net zero facility. So they were basically able to cross off the old building's GHG profile, and the new facility was just zero because the design mandate was net zero. So it's just a consideration and potential positive impact with creating that sustainable building standard.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you very much. Dennis?
Yep, through the chair on slide 37. I just wanted to make sure that I'm interpreting this correctly, but when I look at the GHG reduction plan slide, I see that natural gas blended seems to disappear around 2030, 2039. And I just wanted to make sure that I'm interpreting this correctly. That does this imply, or can I interpret it that the city will, at least with their corporate assets, be like fully electrified by that time? Or am I misinterpreting the fact that I don't think that there's any expected the utility cost of natural gas is going to go down to close to zero by 2039?
Thank you. Who's going to answer this? Caden, is that who's?
Yeah, I can take that since
Okay, perfect. And I
looked at that.
appreciate through the chair, just so everybody knows.
Oh, yes,
So I
sorry.
can maintain order of the meeting. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Very sorry, but
Caden?
thanks for letting me know. So as far as natural gas goes, based on the preliminary plan that we've developed, although this can be, of course, revisited in future iterations, this does have the majority of natural gas being phased out in about 2039, as you commented. There would still be some buildings, for example, no measures are currently being considered for like the Yonge Street offices at this point in time. So there would still be some of those buildings that would still have a small contribution of natural gas. But by 2039, it's anticipated that, the majority of natural gas use will be eliminated. And, because of this, the majority of the cost of natural gas, as well as, any associated federal carbon charge for that natural gas would also be eliminated.
Dennis?
Yes, and through the chair, I have one more data question. So thank you very much for that response. On slide 33, with regards to additional recommendations for all assets, I noted that carbon offsets are suggested as one of those potential recommendations. And 2 figures are included for annual budgets for 2035 and 2050. To get to those numbers, like I'm thinking, okay, that makes sense. Based on your modeling, it doesn't look like with current conditions, the plan is going to make it to our targets. And I feel like the carbon offsets kind of give us some leeway to still be successful. With the calculations though, I'm just wondering, what was the price of a carbon offset that you used in your calculations to come up with those two numbers?
Kaden?
And I will note, this is one thing which has been updated in, the most recent final report that we submitted a few days ago. So this was not in the presentation that we sent. But I'll certainly give you the numbers that we're going to be using in the most recent version. I'm just going to pull that up quickly. Sorry, just need to find it.
It's probably in the
Yes.
order, but oh, go ahead.
Yeah. So right now, there's some uncertainty as to what the carbon offsets will cost in 2050. But currently, based on sort of the Quebec carbon offsets program, the price of carbon offsets are about $30 per ton of CO2e, and we would expect these to be increasing with time, and assumed a general inflation rate of 2.2% every year. And just for reference, the updated numbers that we have would be 35,000 for carbon offsets to achieve a 50% reduction, and then 110,000 in 2050 to achieve net zero.
Thanks, Kaden. Dennis, can you follow up?
Thank you very much.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Shun?
Hello, thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me.
Yep,
Through
we can
you-
hear you.
Perfect. Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. I had a question around the dog waste diversion. I was surprised to see that come up. I wasn't thinking that that would be something that would be considered corporate. I would expect that just to be treated as if it was any of the waste bins and such. So is there a particular reason why that has come up in this report?
I will pass this to Natalie, but I know this is a new initiative that the town of Aurora investigated as a pilot project, and it was separated into a diversion program. But Ms. Keel, maybe you would like to expand on the GHG and diversion part of it?
Through you, Madam Chair, I'll just jump in to answer this one because it's a relatively new program. So the reason why it is included or pet waste is including in the plan is because the town collects the park waste as part of its corporate emissions. So pet waste is obviously included and plentiful in our parks. And what the operations team were noticing is that one of the major contamination of the waste and the recycling bins that they have in public areas were these dog waste or pet waste. So they started this pilot program, I believe in 2021. It's been a couple of years, I think. And they had a lot of success with it, where they had a separate waste system specifically for the dog waste. So it does two things. It decreases the contamination of our recycling stream that are found in the parks. And two, the dog waste is collected and composted and processed in a way that is reduces methane release as it decomposes. So it has like a twofold, a greenhouse gas emission kind of impact. And it's been a big success. And so they've expanded the program even further this year. So we do expect to see of that initiative having an impact on our ability to manage the park waste better going forward. And through those waste audits and waste reduction plans, we'll see more details out of that. But we did want to highlight that this was a new initiative because it's really innovative, and it will help us in the long run with managing our park waste. So that's where it's coming from.
Thanks, Ms. Keel. Shun, any other questions?
No, that was it. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Any other questions from anybody for the first time before I move along? Alain? No? You're good? Ken, do you have any questions at all? No, you're good. And Kristen, just want to make sure. Okay. Go ahead, Nicole.
Sure. So I have another question in regards to slide 37, where it's got the utility cost. And I'm wondering if the town pays a carbon tax based on our emissions. Is there a carbon tax, and is that being factored in terms of the utility or in terms of the cost?
Ms. Keel?
Through you, Madam Chair. I don't have that. Which slide is that? Could you just say?
It's on 37, the utility cost impact.
Oh, okay.
So thinking about if, I don't know where the threshold is for large emitters, you have to pay a carbon tax, but I don't know whether the town falls into that at this point in time, but maybe in the future.
Through you, Madam Chair. Yes, we already pay the carbon tax through our natural gas bills. So it's already, we're already paying it.
Right.
But it's it increases in a stepped manner. So certain years they're gonna, or every year, I think every April, they increase it. And so you're gonna see that escalation on the bill. And it's, I believe, I don't know if Patrick or he didn't want to jump in, but I believe it's at about 20 to 25% of the natural gas bill right now is from the carbon tax. So there is this definitely cost benefit to decrease our natural gas use to reduce that carbon tax as it increases over time on our energy bills.
Nicole?
Oh.
Yeah. Oh,
Sorry.
Patrick, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I can provide comment, and you do, if you're able to see 37, it's noted as federal carbon charge compared to carbon tax in terms of terminology, and we are aligning with the steady increase that Natalie mentioned through to 2030. So there's projection that it will increase every single year on April 1st. Until 2030, when it hits its peak at $170 a ton, and we have delineated that as well, so you can see the impacts of it being there or not being there.
Thanks, Patrick. Natalie, any follow-up questions for the panel?
I do have another, I guess, perhaps more of a comment. It would be better to, instead of obviously using carbon offsets as a last resort and figuring out how to better spend that money by doing retrofits and reducing obviously emissions before doing offsets. So I know that there's talk a lot at the back end around offsets, but figuring out how do we completely reduce before having to do offsets would be, I guess, my recommendation.
Great, thank you. Okay, Councillor Gartner, did you have any other follow-up questions?
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. My apologies for not doing that last time. I'm not good at this. So in the chart, the 2018 comparison with 2022, under gas, there's zero consumption in 2022. In diesel, there's zero consumption in 2022. So what are our town vehicles running on?
Ms. Keel, is that your wheelhouse, or who's gonna chat about
I'll
Caden?
pass this to Caden.
Caden?
Caden dove right
into
down
the fleet?
Yeah.
All right, Caden, I'm gonna pass this to you if you don't mind answering Ms. Gartner, Councillor Gartner's question.
Yep, for sure. So the distinction between 2018 and 2022, Patrick, if you could go to slide, I think it's 10.
Yeah, just doing that now.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Here we go.
Yeah, so sorry, my cat wants attention. So in 2018, the fuel consumed by the fleet was either gasoline or diesel. But then starting in 2020, there was the Ontario Cleaner Fuels Regulation, which mandated a shift so that gasoline would be replaced with ethanol 10 in vehicles, which is like a blend with gasoline and ethanol, and then diesel would be replaced with biodiesel 5. So both of these are, less GHG intensive fuel sources. So in 2018, there was still the gasoline and diesel being used, but then by the time 2022 came around, these were replaced by ethanol 10 and by biodiesel 5. So it's, a little bit difficult to compare precisely from 2018 to 2022. But this is why in 2018, you see ethanol 10 and biodiesel are at 0. But by 2022, gasoline and diesel go to 0 as they're replaced by ethanol 10 and biodiesel 5.
Thank you very much. And if I was a better detective, I could have figured that out from the chart. I'd just like to mention Passive House. I hope we're adding in our OP official plan Passive House to the list because it's a very, very energy efficient way to build. Could you please tell me where the 50% of the waste to energy program, it was said that 50% of our waste is going there. Where are we getting this waste from? What is this waste composed of?
Thank you, Councillor Gardner. Okay. Ms. Keel?
Okay, through you, Madam Chair, I'll take this one. So waste is the first time we're including waste in this plan. And we did not have a waste audit to go off of. So in terms of the composition, we do not know the composition of the waste. And that was one of the recommendations through this plan, is to perform a waste audit for the first time and figure out the composition. So that's, I think, your first question. And then the second piece is we also do not know exactly where our corporate waste is being landfilled or disposing of at this point. It could be part of it. My understanding is a larger pieces of waste tend to go to the landfill, whereas the rest goes to the waste to energy facilities. But again, through the waste audit process, we would gain all this insight into these questions and be able to have a better waste reduction plan, right? It's like we don't have enough of the data to really have a solid action plan at this point. So again, that was one of the recommendations from this plan, was to do the audit to come up with a more solid list of recommendations. So through this process, we still had to get an idea of what we were generating at the facilities and the parks and the public receptors. So through the PCP framework, the Partners for Climate Protection framework, they do have a methodology for this situation, because we're not the first ones to say, hey, we want to put this inventory together, and we haven't done that kind of audit before. So they do have a methodology to support municipalities on estimating as a first kind of round estimation. So that is the methodology that we followed in this process. Caden worked through the calculations, and we worked with operations on gaining all the data that we do have that can feed into that calculation. So that's how it came out. It's not an exact. It's our first go at this generation, that waste generation. So we do recognize that the data could significantly change after going through that waste audit process. Yeah. Right. So, but it gives us an idea as a starting point,
Baseline.
that could change as we go forward and we collect more information and improve our process.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Keel. Councillor Gardner?
Thank you, Ms. Keel. That was a good answer to my question. And I would be very glad if that's true, because 50% of waste to energy would be really great. Although then there's, energy being used to produce that. But so I look forward to some more solid figures. And just a comment on those new dog waste receptacles. Has anybody seen them? They're actually put into the ground. The container for the waste is below ground level, and it's great. The problem is, though, that in order to empty them, the containers have to be at the pretty close to the road. So there's a lot of waste that's being thrown into the bushes. I spoke about that at council, and in some cases, it's people think it's okay because it's biodegradable, but actually it goes into the streams if it happens to be near a stream, and that is what's happening, I think, at the dog park, Natalie. So that was one of the concerns of the Conservation Authority. So everything is good and bad at the same time sometimes. Last question. There's no budget for this. There's no financial cost associated with it. And I don't know, do we have a budget for this? I mean, do we have it in our 10-year capital plan as a budget item?
Thank you, Councillor Gardner. I was going to ask the same thing, but I'm assuming this is like the planning part. And then as council, we decide how we would like to budget accordingly within the plan. Ms. Keel, I don't know if you want to chime in on a little bit about that, but I was going to ask about how much green municipal fund do we have access to for all of this, because it'll be expensive. But
Yeah.
go ahead.
Through you, Madam Chair. So due to the timing of this meeting, we're still finalizing a lot of the details of the projects within the plan and working with our stakeholders. So we did actually, what we've done is for this meeting, we weren't able to supply all those details. And in the May 13th meeting that we have scheduled, for that meeting, you will be supplied the entire draft plan and not just the executive summary. And in it will be the cost, the project costs for this plan. So what you'll see at that point is the 5-year recommendations will go into our 10-year plan, because those are projects that we've identified and we have a good costing idea for those projects. And so that they're already going to be included in the, starting 2025. So it will have to go through that approval process, just like any other plans that come out of the town. Yeah. So we'll just go through that budget process, but starting for 2025. And you'll see the 5-year projects included. Now, the medium term and the long-term projects from this plan are to give a vision of where we want to go. They are not, those medium to long-term projects will not be found in the 10-year capital plan at this point. What you will also see from the plan is that through those 2 feasibility studies that are being recommended through this plan, we hope that through that process, we will be able to better identify medium to long-term projects with better costing data that could then be placed into the 10-year plan. So so what you'll see is more the 5-year short-term period. You'll see a solid list of projects, their costs, and we will take those projects through the budget process starting for 2025 budget. And the remaining, the medium and the long, we want to wait for those feasibility studies to go through first. And so once those get developed and all those projects, they have like more detailed design and costing and more accurate costing information, then we can then start including those into the 10-year planning process. So the costing data is coming in the next couple of weeks. You should be getting the draft plan, and you'll be able to see all those details.
Thanks, Ms. Keel. And I don't know if it's something you can include, but if there is any opportunity to show us any of the Green Municipal Fund of initiatives or grantings that we could potentially be applying for to help offset those costs, I think that's good for council to consider, or at least see in the plan that those opportunities are there.
Yeah, through you. Yes, we are definitely going to be identifying any grant opportunities, especially in this 5-year period. But the great thing is, through those feasibility studies, they should make the town and all of these projects eligible for grant opportunities for the actual implementation, the capital pieces of
Gotcha.
those recommendations. So those feasibility studies and that have been identified are really crucial for us to make progress in the medium and the long term.
Good to
So,
know.
yeah, so you'll be seeing that.
Feasibility studies, Councillor Gardner.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. I do ask very seriously, if 67% of corporate emissions are buildings, I think that the town hall is probably a big offender, because the way it's structured with the atrium on the 3rd floor, it's warm up there and it's cool downstairs. And it seems impossible to regulate the heat so that people are comfortable. So I think it's something that really needs to be looked into. Maybe we can't do anything, but maybe we can. Thank you, Natalie.
Thanks, Councillor Gardner. Ken, for the first
Yes,
time.
well, thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. And maybe this was addressed, but I want to make sure. So when we're talking about fleet, we're talking about Aurora corporate-owned fleet, but I was also thinking too that in terms of fleet, we have a fair bit of contracted out services. So this would be everything from GFL for solid waste collection to contracted snow removal services that complement our own. And I'm wondering two things. Have they been included in terms of our overall fleet calculation, even though they're contracted? And two, whether or not when we go to a process of bids and tenders for renewing contracts, as contracts obviously come up for renewal, in terms of alternate fuels and carbon, towards the carbon net zero, if those are things that are built in to those bids and tenders. Otherwise, I think we're missing a potential opportunity if we continue to renew contracts without putting in those essential criteria in addition to cost, obviously.
Yes, Caden, did Caden handle fleet? Did you handle fleet, Caden? Or is that Patrick?
Yes, I had handled fleet.
Okay.
So regarding, fuel consumption, at this point, we aren't accounting for any fuel consumption from, non-corporate owned vehicles. One of the recommendations that we are including into the plan is basically, starting to monitor some of that, additional fuel consumption. So in addition to that, I believe also engineering services often use personal vehicles to travel between sites, which, is something that's not being considered. So one recommendation for, future versions of this plan is to start, monitoring this and accounting for it as much as possible. But yes, in addition to that, when contracts come up, another very viable recommendation would be to try to be considering the most, I guess the least GHG intensive options possible when you're hiring a new contract.
Thank you very much, Caden. Ken, any other follow-up questions?
No, thank you. And I'll actually, you know what, just through you, Madam Chair, to Councillor Gartner raised a good point about passive house. So we talked about LEED and LEED Gold, but I'm wondering in terms of the mix of building standards and retrofit standards, the extent to which we're looking at alternatives to LEED, because LEED can be, obviously quite expensive, right? Especially if you're gold or platinum. So I'm wondering the extent to which alternatives to LEED are also being examined, and that's my final question. So.
Ms. Keel, or I think that'd be quite a question for Ms. Keel. Is that something that is that a council direction following the LEED, or are we open to other types of models to foster after?
Through you, Madam Chair. So one of the recommendations is to develop a building standard for major renovations and for new builds and new acquisitions. So through that standard, we would build the standard through internal processes, stakeholder review within the town, and putting together best practices and come up with a standard or a policy where we would abide by that.
Right.
And that would go to council for approval.
Have the green development design standards that we had just released not
That's
too long
right.
ago, which has four different stages
Yeah.
of design standards. Now they're not enforceable, but those choices are there, and the town does encourage to follow those steps with
Yeah.
certain incentives to that. But we also are adhered to the Ontario Building Code, and so because of that, they don't have to adhere to it. But most developers want to work with us as much as they can. Just wanted to add that.
Yeah, perfect. Exactly. So we have the new green development standard, and as a municipality, we should as a minimum follow that standard for any new builds or major renovations. We do have a council motion, I believe from 2018, that was setting LEED silver as a minimum for new corporate builds, which the town did with the JOC, getting LEED Gold. So it would, through the development of this building standard, we would set a new standard essentially, and the passive house would be considered. There are some net zero designs as well that are becoming more common. So that would be considered the green development standard. What we have as the town would also be considered through that process, and then it would go to council to get approved or endorsed as the new policy for any new builds or new acquisitions.
As well as our climate lens as well. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I do want to make a comment about the bicentennials. A great point. So thank you, Ken, for that, bringing that up. That is something that I've been trying to integrating a climate lens into different aspects of our operations. We now have them on our staff reports for staff to make considerations. We've added it to the budget approval process where staff need to comment on their projects and the climate and take a climate lens perspective for each project. So I think I have done a few examples where we have added wording and requirements for different projects in the RFPs to have a climate lens, a type of climate lens through the project. So I do hope to expand that with procurement and work with them more on getting almost like a standard wording or minimum requirement for a climate lens. And unfortunately, there's not standard to follow. It's still quite new, and a lot of projects are it's project specific. So one project might have a certain kind of lens and it wouldn't apply to another kind of project. So it is a work in progress. But I think that was a great point to bring up, and there's definitely opportunity to leverage that more with our projects. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Keel. Appreciate it. Ken, any other comments? You're good? Great. Any other comments or questions to the report or the presentation before we wrap up? No, we're good. All right, we've got a lot on the docket here. We had a lot discussed. That's great. I love it. Lots of comments to take back, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so if there's no other further comments or questions, I'll call the vote. All those in favor? Opposed? That carries. Thank you so much, guys. We don't have any other additional information. I am going to be mindful of time because it is 10 to 9. So number 9, new business. So we'll just keep it quick. Does anybody here have new business to share? Okay, I guess that's quick. There's no new business. Oh, Ken.
Sorry, through you, Madam Chair again. Just to raise awareness of the upcoming spring cleanup across our town. I think that's coming up in the next couple of weeks. So, yeah, I think that is a really worthwhile initiative to, and kudos to the town for promoting that. And so I think that there will be garbage bags at the end of streets, and so as long as people realize that they're there because people have collected garbage, not because people have dumped their garbage, which is sometimes common, it's always good to continue to share through social media. But just wanted to raise that as a great environmental initiative.
Great. Thank you very much, Ken. And also, I think the town's also doing invasive species as well. Sorry, Ms. Keel, you wanted to add on that?
I did want to also let everyone know about our annual EV showcase that is
Yes.
on April 28th. So if you have any questions about electric vehicles, or you want to test drive one, or talk to some experts, or even we have the EV Society there. So those are residents who already own an EV and gone through the purchasing and operation and charging process. So tons of resources. It's a free event, April 28th from 10 to 5 at the start, and it's indoors. We're always rained out. So this year we're indoors. So bring your family. There's a kids zone. There'll be you can try out e-scooters, e-bikes, e-boards. I don't know if that's the right word. Electric skateboards, and electric vehicles. They'll have free test driving. So also wanted to bring that up. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Yes, I hear that Aurora has grown significantly in that show, and a lot of people are gaining traction outside the municipality. You know about this event, and it's become really successful. So that's great. All right. Any other new business before we adjourn? No? Perfect. All right. Thank you very much for new business. All right. So I guess it is time to adjourn. So may I have a motion to adjourn? Alain? Nicole? Thank you very much. All those in favor? Opposed? That carries. Thank you very much, everybody. And I guess we'll see everybody was at May 13th. And we'll be discussing probably this again and seeing the full picture and also the budget items as well, which is something I think that we're all kind of looking forward to, because we know it's going to cost the town some money in order to make these conversions, but all for a good cause.